Chapter 21. True Love's Kiss. The sword flew true. It struck Maleficent in the chest, and blood spilled down her amethyst underbelly. She howled and recoiled. Philip braced himself, glaring up at the sliver of her eyes. Her head bobbed back. Philip's terror sharpened the world to that single moment, and he leapt over her gnashing jaws. The cliff crumbled beneath them, and Philip threw himself backward. His fingers tore through rock, barely catching the edge. He clung as tightly as he could, panic holding his hands in place despite the pain. Maleficent crashed to the ground. Oily black smoke clogged the air, and her screams died. Philip crawled onto the top of what was left of the cliff. The smoke lingered in his throat and stopped his shout. He wiped his face and peered over the edge. All that was left of Maleficent was a midnight smear pinned to the earth by the sword of truth. Philip almost laughed. It was done. The slow clack of hooves against stone came up the cliff behind Philip, and he smiled at Samson's unharmed form. The courser snorted softly, and Philip gripped his reins. The fairies lingered over Philip's shoulder. "You all right, Samson?" Philip asked, focusing on the horse so he wouldn't have to think about everything that had happened and what he still had to do. Endless carrots. Infinite carrots. As many as you can eat without dying. Samson nickered and laid his head against Philip's shoulder, letting Philip pull a few scorched pieces of wood from his mane. There was so much left to do, despite the exhaustion tugging at his bones, and Philip sat up until he could see the spires of the castle in the distance. He had to wake Briar Rose first and tell her what had happened, and find out for sure if he was her true love. The very idea of her not waking turned his stomach. Or maybe it was the smoke. Definitely the smoke. "Your Highness," said Flora, flickering in the corner of his sight. "Princess Aurora and the others are waiting." "Joanna," he said, "is there a way to retrieve her?" Merryweather nodded sharply and flicked her wand, creating a cloudy image between them so like the one Maleficent had summoned that Philip shivered. "Now let's see," she said, moving her wand like a spyglass and adjusting what the image was showing. "Your squire will need her horse as well. With Maleficent gone and the old magic binding her to the Forbidden Mountain gone with her, this should be much easier." There was a burst of warm air that reminded him of spring, and a whistle like a bird. Down the cliff on the road to the castle, Joanna and Taliesin appeared in an explosion of soap bubbles. Joanna, exhausted and soaked with sweat but beaming, threw her arms around Taliesin's neck, and Samson cantered over to bump Taliesin's flank. Philip met Joanna in the middle. "How'd it go?" he asked, wrapping her in a hug. "What's going on?" she asked, but returned the embrace. "Where's Maleficent?" "Gone," said Philip. He stepped back and wiped some ash from her face. "She's dead. For good, I think." He glanced back at Merryweather, and she nodded. Joanna gently punched his arm a few times, and he grinned. "Time is of the essence, Your Highness," said Flora, fluttering over to his shoulder. "The other fairies are still trapped, yes?" Poena's out cold, and Fright spent the last while flying around and crying because of that cut on her arm, Joanna said, and shook her head. "Eris either is invisible and hiding, or got out. She panicked when I downed Poena." "Good girl," Merryweather applauded quietly. "2 fairies taken down and 1 scared off is nothing to sneeze at, you know." Philip smiled and knocked his shoulder against Joanna's. Worth a knighthood at the very least. Joanna blushed and Philip patted Talison's snout. Come on, Sir Joanna. Philip helped her onto Taliesin and then mounted Samson. Everyone in the area is asleep until Princess Aurora is awakened. Get to the healing house and prepare to help once everyone is awake. I'll get the princess. Asleep? She asked. Philip nodded. You'll see. They traveled in silence, staring at the distant towers of the castle. The forest of thorns was gone, but there was still an unsettling prickle on the back of Philip's neck. The only sounds were the flutter of the fairy's wings and the stomp of Samson's hooves. Philip flinched as they passed the first people. I see, mumbled Joanna, her mouth falling open. People had slumped over where they stood. Some swayed, and others had slipped all the way to the paving stones. A child slept alone in the corner of the gate, and a woman was half submerged in the center fountain. Philip maneuvered Samson through the crowd like he would navigate a wood. We did not wish for Princess Aurora to awaken alone, said one of the fairies. Not that we had anything but the utmost confidence in His Highness quickly rescuing her, but it was a precaution. No one should be hurt or even notice they fell asleep. Joanna touched one person's shoulder, and they snored. She jerked back. Right, she said. I'll go make sure the healing house is ready in case anyone wakes up and panics. Please do, said Philip, reaching across Samson and tugging Joanna close. He gripped her collar. Do not start writing a book about this. She grinned and patted his hand away. An ode it is. Better than your eulogy, he muttered, and she laughed all the way to the healing house. Philip jogged into the courtyard, where the groves of people were thinner, and glanced around for the tower. Entrance. The sooner he could speak with Briar Rose, the better. He wanted to know that she was well. He wanted to tell her everything. He wanted her awake before him so that they could speak without the threat of everything hanging over them. He just wanted her. But what if she didn't wake up? They were getting along well now, and he wanted to be her true love. But knowing someone and wanting them wasn't love. True love was supposed to be all encompassing and legendary. And while Philip knew how he felt, true love still seemed too much like a fairy tale to involve him. Briar Rose had to ask him to kiss her, though. All that was left to do was honor her request and hope. The fairies led the way through the castle. Philip chased after them, furious he hadn't paid more attention when visiting. Higher and higher they spiraled, but Philip's exhaustion fell away as he felt himself getting closer to Briar Rose. He sprinted up the final steps and into her resting place. The sight of her still took his breath away. The life had been sapped from her, blanching her skin to a bluish white and leaving her lips a pale pink. Briar Rose had always been vibrant, in life and in dreams, and this stillness made his hands shake. Philip had always longed to see her, but now all he wanted was to hear her voice. The fairies hovered near the door, watching. He knelt at Briar Rose's side, nerves fluttering through him. He braced a hand on his knee to keep from shaking. Her chest rose with a slow breath, and he sighed. He was far more afraid of what came next than he had been of fighting Maleficent. What would he do if he kissed her and she didn't wake? Would he be forced to go off and find her true love, her real true love? Could his heart suffer such a task? Philip leaned close to her. He touched her hand, half hoping the cursed sleep had lifted when Maleficent died, but Briar Rose didn't move. Philip bowed over her head and hesitated a hair breadth from her lips. Philip pulled away, his heart racing, and shook his head. He didn't want it to not work. But Briar Rose had asked him to do this. He had to try for her. Gently, Philip pressed his mouth to hers and then moved away. He stayed on his knees at her side, one hand gripping hers. Her chest rose and fell with steady breaths, but the rest of her stayed as still as the grave. Dread and disappointment began to creep over him, and Philip slipped his hand from hers. It hadn't worked. Philip gritted his teeth and tried to hide his grief from the 3 good fairies looming at the door. He had known it. He wasn't... Briar Rose blinked up at him. Her violet eyes darkened the dim light. His heart condensed, and every thought in his mind quieted it. "I know you defeated Maleficent," she whispered. "So why do you look so terrified?" "I woke you up," said Philip, still in disbelief. "Me?" "You," she said. "Is it really so terrible?" "It's just..." He swallowed, shook his head, swallowed again. "You really love me?" Briar Rose laughed softly and beckoned him down to her. "You literally just woke me with true love's kiss. Is the evidence not enough?" "Yes, I love you." Philip couldn't stop a painfully wide grin from taking over his expression, and he was sure he would never stop smiling. Philip gestured to himself. "Me?" "Him." "You're lucky you're pretty," Briar Rose said, and tossed the rose in her hands aside. Briar Rose grabbed his collar and tugged him down to her in an embrace. She smelled like spring in the dream wood, fresh leaves and cool water. He tucked his face into the curve of her neck and inhaled. Her fingers combed through the sweaty, tangled ends of his hair. "I heard everything while I was in the dream wood," she said. One of the fairies cleared her throat, and Philip glanced at them. Briar Rose stilled. "Aunt Flora?" she asked. "What dreams do you mean, dear?" asked Flora. Merryweather cleared her throat again. "And what did you hear?" "Oh, well, everything Philip did," said Briar Rose, blushing. "I suppose I kept a secret from you all as well. Philip and I have always dreamed of each other." "There's this old forest," Philip added, "and there was this thorn wall that was separating us. We could never talk until the day we could. But these last weeks, the forest became this maze, and then it..." He looked at Briar Rose, and she raised her eyebrows. "It vanished the last dream we had, but neither of us knew why it was there, or why we were even dreaming of the other." "Oh!" Fauna clutched her chest, tears in her eyes. "It looks like Merryweather's gift had more impact than we thought," Flora said and smiled. "True love is its own kind of magic, and true love always finds a way to bring people together, even when curses seek to keep them apart. The curse was always within you, my dear, at first as the thorn wall and then as the maze that separated you. But I would guess that this last dream was the first one you shared after falling in love." "We only found our way out of the maze after we stopped fighting," said Philip. Briar Rose nodded. "And we could only talk to each other once the curse was almost here." "True love," said Merryweather, beaming at both of them in turn. "Striving to bring you together before the curse took hold." "So magic believed in us?" Philip turned back to Briar Rose and grinned. "I believed in us," she said. "And you did so well. I told you that you would." "Did you?" he mumbled. "I missed your humility. I will not apologize for being right." "I would never ask that of you," he said and laughed. "True love." "I'm going to kiss you again, unless you wouldn't like that," she said softly, running her thumb along the hollow of his throat. "I think you owe me a proper first kiss." There were no thoughts left in his head, so Philip said, "I would hate to be in debt to you." Her lips slid over his as easily as he usually slipped into dreams. The blood rushed in his veins, and the bottom of the world fell away, leaving nothing but the warmth of her fingers against his throat and the flutter of her lashes against his cheek. She gripped him tighter, his tongue... A throat cleared behind them. Briar Rose pulled away first and peered over his shoulder. Philip had forgotten about the fairies. but he couldn't find it in him to be embarrassed. He felt buoyant. There was no opinion that could ever drag him down again. He was unbelievably happy for the first time in years. "I thought he was supposed to kiss me," said Briar Rose, putting on a confused tone, and he hid a laugh in her shoulder. "What's wrong?" "You are truly lovely," he muttered, and kissed her cheek. "You'll be the death of us, girl," said Flora. "You are both expected downstairs. There's still a party to attend, your parents to meet, and a story to tell." "They can wait. I had to," said Briar Rose, and she narrowed her eyes at the spluttering fairy over Philip's shoulder. "I just awoke from a curse on top of finding out who I was today. Perhaps you should go warn them we'll be there in a moment." The fairies whispered behind them, and Philip struggled not to mind or worry about what they were saying. Philip helped her sit up, keeping one hand on her arm. "Happy birthday, by the way," he said, enjoying the decadence of being able to see her expressions and play with her hair. Growing up knowing he was betrothed to Princess Aurora, he had never allowed himself to bask in affection. He spent a few minutes summarizing his flight from the Forbidden Mountain and the fight with Maleficent. Briar Rose gasped at all the right parts, mostly to mock his serious tone. He kissed her brow once he was done. "Also, I think our wedding is happening downstairs." She made a face. "We're not getting married tonight, right?" "Absolutely not, and I cannot wait to see their faces when they find out." He kissed her quickly and held out his hand. "Do you feel up to disappointing your parents for the first time?" "It's a momentous occasion. I remember mine fondly." She laughed and took his hand, rising from the bed. "How do I look?" "So disappointing," he said, brushing her hair over her shoulders and twisting a strand around his finger. "Well, you would know," she said, but there was no sharpness behind the words. She stood on tiptoe and kissed his cheek. She whispered, "We defeated Maleficent. If anyone is actually disappointed, it's their loss." Philip laughed, and she tugged him closer. "Philip," she said, holding both of his hands in hers, "I know you spent years struggling against our betrothal and hating the idea of obeying even though you were prepared to go through with it. If you want to leave now, I wouldn't blame you." He wasn't sure love could flourish with only a few words, but this was the most beloved he had ever felt. Briar Rose was watching him through slightly narrowed eyes, clearly concerned, but offering him the thing he had wanted the most. She knew exactly what the Philip of a month earlier would have chosen: to leave. Yet she was letting him decide, even when she thought his answer would hurt her. But he wasn't that Philip anymore. "I don't want to go." He glanced at the fairies and dropped his voice. "I don't want to get married now, and I don't want to follow our parents' plan for us. I don't even want to stay in Altor or Artwine. I want to travel and figure out who I am outside my father's shadow, and I want to do all that with you, if you would like that as well." Briar Rose nodded, her nose scrunched up from smiling. "I want to go everywhere." Joy like he never before known flooded his veins, and Philip knew that this was true love, wanting to face the world with someone who knew all your best and worst parts, helping them achieve their dreams and basking in their successes. Trust, bravery, love. Together, they can do anything. The fairies fluttered about them as they descended. Voices rose up the stairwell as they moved down. It was obvious that everyone was awake, and there didn't seem to be any panic. All Philip could hear were happy shouts and distant bursts of song. It sounded like a grand party downstairs. Once they reached the main floor, the fairies flew off to alert the heralds. "Do you think they noticed that they fell asleep?" he asked Briar Rose. She watched the dancing and shook her head. I don't think I would have noticed if I hadn't been expecting it and hadn't woken up in a different place, she said. I won't tell them if you don't. He grinned and kissed her hand. I'll bet you everything in my purse they don't mention Maleficent for a whole hour. Deal. The fanfare of trumpets echoed through the castle. Philip tucked her hand into the crook of his arm. Slowly walking down the main staircase, King Stefan and Queen Leah sat on their thrones at the end of the hall, and Philip's father lounged near them. The Queen's eyes widened when she spotted them, her sad smile making his heart ache. Briar Rose stiffened, and he brushed his thumb over her hand. King Stefan's smile, though, was all joy. It's Aurora, he said, stepping hesitantly toward them. She's here! You're not very good at disappointing people, whispered Philip. He grinned at her and squeezed her hand against his side. Still time to back out, but if we leave, we'll miss my father's floundering. She laughed under her breath, staring ahead and clearly trying not to look at all the people around them. He won't be that bad, will he? Philip snorted. You're lucky we're not betting on it. And Philip, cried King Hubert. Briar Rose's shoulders shook against his for a moment, and he bowed his head to hide his own laugh. A few steps from the platform, they came to a stop. He bowed, and Briar Rose curtsied, still clutching his arm. Philip straightened and felt Briar Rose stiffen again, her gaze rising to her parents. Then she seemed to shrug off her hesitation and squeezed his arm. He moved to let her go. Briar Rose ran to her mother. Philip took a step back, looking at his nearing father from the corner of his eye. What does this mean, boy? King Hubert asked Philip. Before Philip had time to come up with a quip, Briar Rose swooped in and kissed King Hubert on the cheek. He went quiet. Philip took that chance to sweep Briar Rose away. He pulled her into his arms, ignoring his father's babbling. Briar Rose and he fell easily into the same steps as in their dance in the wood, and the people around them watched. Philip couldn't find it within him to care. He simply pulled her closer and smiled. Let his father be confused. Let everyone stare. No opinions on this matter save for Briar Rose's and his. There was a tickle in his throat, and what felt like a spring breeze rustled through his hair. Briar Rose groaned. They're so competitive, she muttered as her dress shifted from blue to pink. The people around them began murmuring. Competitive, said Philip, laughing when it switched back to blue. Yes, I'm beginning to understand that. Do you want them to stop? He eyed the good fairies off to the side. No, they wouldn't be themselves if they weren't like this, and I do love them, she said, and kicked up her heels so the dress switched just so it changed to pale pink again. She tilted her face up to him. What now? Philip twirled her once more, and the people watching them faded away with the troubles of the past day. We lived happily ever after, of course.